Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be getting started in about 1 minute.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2. It's going to be a great day, so let's get moving. I think you're going to find today as exciting and fascinating as yesterday. We've got a great lineup of speakers, so hold on to your seat.
Merci. Alors, merci de vous joindre à nous pour cette deuxième journée de Govmaker. Nous espérons que vous allez passer une journée absolument extraordinaire parce qu'on a vraiment des choses intéressantes. In case you were not with us today, I'm Cyril Simard, and I will be co-chair with Cheryl. We'll be here all day to introduce the speakers and the sessions and keep things moving as fluently as possible. Alors, nous vous réservons plein de bonnes choses aujourd'hui. Le défi de visualisation, even in French, this one is difficult. Les données ouvertes touchent à sa fin, alors n'oublions pas de voter pour le prix du public d'ici 11h15 ce matin. Les 5 finalistes feront alors leur présentation au jury pour remporter le premier prix. Et vous êtes certainement aussi impatients que moi de voir ce ces groupes-là ont préparé pour nous avec les données ouvertes du gouvernement pour créer de nouvelles options politiques et des solutions intéressantes. Alors, c'est vraiment une belle expérience de gouvernement ouvert à l'œuvre. L'adresse pour voter, odvc.squarespace.com. Cheryl?
Thank you. Again, for the Open Data Visualization Challenge, the URL to vote for the People's Choice Award by 11:15 is odvc, I can't even do it in English, .squarespace.com. As if the great talks on day 1 were not enough, the data challenge and today's workshops will be worth the price of admission. And personally, I'm looking forward to the wonderful treats we always have at the last snack break. And Lauren has promised to have chocolate, hopefully. After a day and a half of delicious healthy eating, our organizing committee chair, Shani Beaulieu, always gives us a special sweet treat to boost our energy for the last session. Do stay for the full day so you won't miss out on the treats or our last keynote speaker from Colleen McCormick. She's going to bring us out of here on a high so we can take the energy of Govmaker back to our workspaces and our daily lives and harness it for all of the great changes we will achieve together. And let's take a moment not to thank the board and staff of the New Brunswick Social Policy Research Network for bringing us Govmaker every year. It is an opportunity for learning collaboration we could not do without. Thank you. Now the important things. I have to address a few housekeeping items, and then I will pass off to my co-chair to introduce the first keynote. I just want to remind people to please return the headphones if you're using them for translation. We're just missing a few, so they might accidentally be around here. So the table is in the back, so at the end of the day, we could have the headphones. That would be awesome. The washrooms are right outside these doors, to the right, down the hall. For presenters, please present to the tech booth over here 10 minutes before your session so we can set up your microphone. And we will be doing timekeeping as well. So, Cyril?
Alors, je vous rappelle gentiment de désactiver les sonneries de votre téléphone cellulaire. A gentle reminder to turn off your cell phone ringer. Nous vous remercions évidemment notre commanditaire du niveau diamant, qui est le gouvernement du Nouveau-Brunswick, ainsi que nos commanditaires argent, Bio Nouveau-Brunswick et le Centre Pond d'Eshpondé. You will see evaluation forms on your tables. I don't know if they're there right now, Norma? They'll get there later on. And help us with our funders by telling us what you liked and learned from this event. And finally, for Tweeps, conference hashtag is #Govmaker. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote of the day, Alex Ryan. So Alex Ryan est vice-président, responsable de l'innovation et des systèmes et directeur des programmes chez Mars Solutions Lab. Il aime surtout passer du temps avec son épouse, ce qui est très gentil, Eleanor, et réunir divers groupes de participants pour trouver ensemble des solutions innovatrices aux défis sociaux les plus importants et les plus complexes. Alex is VP at Systems Innovation and Program Director of the Mars Solutions Lab. He most enjoys spending time with his wife, Eleanor, and bringing diverse groups of participants together to jointly innovate on society's most complex and important challenges. Alex co-founded Alberta CoLab, the first provincial government innovation lab in Canada. After his talk, he will be giving us a workshop on prototyping policy. So please welcome Alex Ryan.
Bonjour. Good morning. Good day. So I first started my journey into launching and leading systemic design teams and social innovation labs 9 years ago. And so in putting this talk together, I've prepared 9 lessons from those 9 years of labcraft. And I'm going to tell you 3 stories from the 3 major organizations I've worked with over that period. So my journey begins in 2008 when I was asked to join the faculty of the School of Advanced Military Studies in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I moved there to teach a new thing that the US Army was introducing called systemic operational design. Now in 2008, the US Army was the best planning organization on the planet. They were the best trained, the most technologically advanced army in the world, and they were losing 2 wars against vastly inferior forces. So they had a pretty powerful incentive to be looking for something new and something different and to rethink everything. And at the School of Advanced Military Studies, we were rethinking the way that they did their military planning process. So the idea of systemic operational design brought systems thinking together with design thinking and used that to work on military operational art, which is the bridge between strategy and tactics. And the easiest way I can explain to you how different this looked is to show you the most famous graphic from the Gulf War in 1991. This is a plan that students, graduates of the School of Advanced Military Studies helped to conceive for the ground campaign. And when you look at the map, the really interesting thing to note, this is a massive operation. You've got 31 coalition nations involved in this operation, but it's a pretty straightforward plan. It's the famous left hook, a flanking maneuver, that from after 6 weeks of aerial campaign, within 100 hours of the ground campaign launching, Saddam Hussein had surrendered. And so this was the first time that GPS had been used in warfare. It was the first time we had live reporting in a battlefield, but essentially the battle was rolling tanks and armored vehicles over a big desert. Fast forward to 2009, and this is the most famous visualization of the strategy in Afghanistan. It made the front page of the Washington Post. Jon Stewart satirized it and called it Afghandiland. Eric Burlow did a TED Talk applying food web mapping software to find the leverage points in this system. And so what you notice here is a very different expression of military planning. First of all, the thing that leaps out to you is the complexity. And as we heard yesterday from Kent, maybe it's not that the world is more complex, but our recognition of that complexity. The second thing you'll notice is that it's not just red versus blue, like the previous map. There are many different shades of red, there are many different shades of blue, and at the center of it all is the green, which is the population. So, whereas the other map was a plan on geographic terrain, this is a plan on human terrain. And we actually use that metaphor of human terrain to help the military understand why they should embed anthropologists into their units in Afghanistan to understand complex tribal dynamics. Because the military already knew the value of knowing the terrain you're operating on. So why wouldn't we get to know the cultures and the populations that we're working in too? So it's very complex, lots of feedback loops connecting all of the pieces, understanding this as a system. And the way we would teach design at the School of Advanced Military Studies would be to take on live scenarios and embed and immerse the students in solving them. And what I want to do is tell you a story about looking at the Mexican drug violence as an example of showing the power of combining systems thinking with design thinking to be able to reframe problems and see things differently. So we set up a joint interagency task force. This is 2011, and we're looking at what's happening just across the border from the US in Mexico. We're seeing 50,000 casualties from this drug violence. And so the first thing the design team had to do was really empathize with the Arizona ranchers, but also empathize with the Mexican population who are writing songs and ballads about the cartels, and also the cartels themselves who have codes that they're operating by and understand why they're using violence so symbolically. As we looked at that, we also asked the question, why? Why is this happening? And what we realized was that what we're seeing here in Mexico is actually the symptom of a solution to a previous problem. So you'll remember in the 1980s, President Nixon declared war on drugs. And that framing has been the dominant framing ever since. And to solve the violence that was escalating in Miami due to the drug trade, the cocaine coming up from Colombia, they set up, sorry, it was Reagan, not Nixon. They set up the South Florida Drug Task Force. And the South Florida Drug Task Force interdicted the supply lines into Miami, and it was very successful in eliminating the drug trade in South Florida. But of course, it did nothing to address the demand problem, and so what the Colombian cartels did was they rerouted supply in through the Mexican marijuana cartels, and now the drug trade become embedded in the population, which means it's much harder to detect and much harder to interdict. It also means to move drugs through populations, you have to pay a lot of people off, which meant that it increased corruption. When President Calderon decided to address the corruption, he took a kingpin strategy. Let's target the leaders of these cartels, which makes sense because there are only a couple of cartel leaders, but there are millions of drug producers. So it's a logical point to intervene. But as you started to decapitate the cartels, what you end up doing is fragmenting the cartels. And so now you've got 7 cartels fighting over 3 main supply routes into the US. And that, along with the war from the Mexican government on the cartels, was the source of all of this violence. And so as we began to understand the problem, then we started to look for leverage points. How can we actually improve this? And as we saw with the South Florida Drug Task Force issue, just interdicting supply routes does nothing of significant value when you're looking at the long-term solving of a problem like the drug war. Because drugs are inelastic, so if you can cut off supply, you raise prices, which makes other pathways more profitable. Maybe now you go with submarines. And so the real leverage point here is to look at demand reduction. And the research showed that that was actually the most efficient place to intervene in this system. Rehabilitation of drug users is 7 times more efficient than doing law enforcement. It's 10 times more efficient than doing intercepts at the border. And it's 27 times more efficient than doing crop eradication in Colombia. And yet, because this has been framed as a war on drugs, 93% of the $40 billion annually spent on the war on drugs goes into interdicting supply, not reducing demand. It's much better headline to do a big drug bust than it is to say we just took one addict off the street and cured them today. So the strategy that this Joint Interagency Task Force came up with wasn't about interfering in Mexico. It was about solving the US's own drug addiction problems. And there was a role for security, but that role was to canalize the drug flow away from the populations so that it wouldn't cause as much harm to the people through the civilian casualties and also through the corruption. So what I really like about this particular example is that if you had given this problem, like prevent the spillover violence from the Mexican drug war to the US, if you'd given that to a set of army officers using the old planning approach, they could never have arrived at the strategy that this team arrived at. Because the old approach to planning was you get given your order from a higher headquarter, you take that order and you do mission analysis, which means you take the mission and you decompose it into its tasks, and then you figure out how to solve each of those tasks. You generate options, you make a decision, and then you go out and execute. But at no point do you ever question if the problem that you've received is the problem you should be solving. And so the really important and interesting thing that happens here as you go through one of these systemic design inquiries is the process of reframing. A shift in framing means that you get to see the same problem from a different perspective. And that was really the power that I saw in this approach that we brought to the US Army. So after 3 years teaching at the school, I then went around to major military headquarters, including Special Operations Command and Strategic Command, and helped them to stand up design teams. And I got to see different models of doing this. So SOCOM took a very democratic approach. They said everyone in our organization needs to understand design. So let's give everyone a 2-week course when they get posted in. Everyone will learn it and everybody will use it. A lot of the design work happened in their plans area, the future planning part of the headquarters, but everybody got some general exposure. Strategic Command took a different approach. They said, we want one team of about 13 people to be trained really deep in this, and they're going to report directly to the commander, and they will do the design work for us. And they were given a mission for Strategic Command, prevent global strategic surprise. And this is an organization that has control of the global nuclear fleet, who has authorization for cyberspace and space, and this team of 11 people was supposed to prevent that global surprise. So as I got to interact with these 2 different structures over a course of several years, I actually began to feel like both of those models were flawed. The problem with the SOCOM model was that because of the rotation cycle in the Army, where people would rotate in and out of positions every couple of years, you could maintain a familiarity, but you could never develop depth of expertise. And so even after SOCOM had been doing design for 5 years, they hadn't gotten any better at it. They hadn't evolved their approach. Stratcom was able to develop depth of expertise, and yet they were very fragile as a team. As soon as you put in a special team with special access to the commander, you create resentment in the rest of the staff. And secondly, as soon as that commander rotates out, you get a new guy in, and he had no understanding of design, no interest in a design team, no knowledge of how to use that asset. And so the design team still exists, but it kind of floated away and became more marginalized. It was no longer looking at the big strategic issues for the team. And so I was trying to think, like, is there an alternative to either of these two models? So these are the 3 lessons I took away from that experience. Number one, I was really impressed by the power of bringing systems thinking together with design thinking as a way for us to do this frame-shifting, discontinuous improvement. Number two, as we took design, we initially experimented in the school with small groups of these really smart officers. We then took it through experimentation and showed, like, empirically the benefits of this approach. And then we rolled this out into the Army doctrine. And that meant that this was now the official way that the US Army does its planning for an organization of 1.4 million people. Now, when we first brought design into the Army, we were emphasizing how this is new and radical and different and innovative. To get it to the scale of organizational adoption of an organization of 1.4 million people, you had to sell it in completely the opposite way. You had to make this seem safe and obvious and familiar and just like the kind of thing the Army should be doing anyway. And so we did things like we translated the language of design. So we didn't talk about ethnographic research and we didn't talk about co-creation. We said that design's a form of conceptual planning that helps to frame problems before you go and solve them. We didn't threaten the existing planning paradigm. We just complemented it with what design could add. And thirdly, from this SOCOM-STRATCOM experience, the lesson I took away is if you're going to set up a dedicated innovation team, then it has to be a catalyst. It can't be a bottleneck. It can't be an ivory tower where all the cool people hang out. So one of my students in the master's course I taught at the School of Advanced Military Studies was Canadian Forces. He came back to Canada, retired from the Army, and joined the government of Alberta as an assistant deputy minister. And he said, we have complex, ambiguous problems here too. We need this kind of approach. And so I came up to Alberta in February, to Edmonton, and ran a couple workshops. We brought 19 assistant deputy ministers and executive directors across 5 ministries together. We ran a 6-day kind of event to train them, but also take on a real problem in natural resource management. And that was in 2012. And we did a bit of like consulting, kind of dipped the toe in the water with systemic design for a couple of years. And then in 2014, they said, Alex, we want you to come up to Alberta and set up a lab inside of government. And so we built a studio. You can see a photo of the studio here. It has whiteboards on all the walls. We built a team, and we started doing this work across the entire government of Alberta. And so, like Hillary said yesterday, when you bring in a new idea and nobody has an idea, a clue what it is, show, don't tell. And so our basic strategy was we're going to work with the willing, we're going to plant many seeds and just try lots of experiments across government, see what works. And taking the lesson from the military world, be a catalyst, not a bottleneck, which meant that we spent at least a third of our time in building out training resources, building capacity, running free courses for civil servants, building method cards and resources that we could share with people. And so we did that, and in our first year, we ran 38 projects across every ministry of government. And not all of them succeeded. There were many that didn't really go anywhere, but one that was a really cool project was our work with GOA International. And the reason we brought people together here was that we had a situation where Alberta's an export province, and so we would send delegations from our ministries overseas, and we could have a situation where two ministries might visit the same country a couple months apart, talk to the same people, and not necessarily be aware of the other visits that were happening. And so we realized that we needed a more coordinated, a whole-of-government approach to international engagement. And so the way that we approached this was to bring people together for a 2-day design session, which actually turned into a year-long design project. And in that first 2-day session, what we did was we framed out the problem. We identified 3 key things that we needed. First of all, we needed a new information management system that was common across the government. Secondly, we needed a client relationship management system across the government. Thirdly, we needed a common narrative as well as common measures of how we were assessing the use of international engagement. And so the really remarkable thing I saw in this first 2-day workshop is that people weren't just sharing information across ministries. They were actually putting resources on the table. They were putting dollars for contracting, they were putting staff on the table, and they created this pooled asset that we were able to use to really push this whole-of-government process forward. And we also, they enjoyed the design workshop so much that they said, this is the process we want to do to make this happen. And so every 2 months, we would hold a half-day design session. It was open, it was participatory, bringing everyone together. And then in between those sessions, we had an agile process where the core team would take the guidance from the whole-of-government group and say, we're going to actually deliver product and implement on that. And so it generated this huge sense of momentum where every time you'd bring people together, you would see that there was progress and change. It also was highly participatory in that everybody got to see their voice in the process. And so in this way, we were able to move forward something in a very different way for the government, much faster than they imagined was possible. So we did this for 2 years. This is our team at the end of 2 years, the eight people in CoLab. And we had now completed a little over 60 projects. We did our second developmental evaluation review. And we identified the things that we were proudest of, our successes. Number one, we had shifted behaviour across the government. And this was evident because we would have teams come and book the CoLab space and use the studio and use design methods and systems thinking methods without us even knowing about it. We'd just see them turn up in the lab and do the work. So even if our team was cut, the following week, we knew that people would still be doing this kind of behaviour within the government. We'd built 2 communities of practice with over 300 people practicing systemic design and strategic foresight. And we were starting to see other ministries follow suit. So Alberta Health Services set up Design for AHS, a service design team on the front line that we helped to train and help them to launch. We helped the City of Calgary launch Civic Innovation YYC. So now the city was doing this too. And more recently, the Ministry of Education launched Studio 44, another systemic design studio. And we started to see job positions advertised in many ministries for systemic designers, something that people didn't even know what this was a couple of years ago. So we knew that it was starting to take hold culturally and behaviourally. Secondly, we knew the demand signal was there. Nobody had to be convinced that they had complex problems and that they needed a different approach. For every workshop we ran, people would come and ask us to do more workshops and more projects, and we had to say no to 3 for every one that we took on. And thirdly, we knew that we had created some new value. There were examples that we had done this work where we saw new services that were now in place, like the regional dashboard. We saw new strategies like our open government strategy that we had helped to develop. And we saw new organisational forms like the Rail Transportation Task Team, novel cross-ministry collaborations that were a result of the design work that we'd done. So we knew that we had some good results there and we'd created some new value. But we also had some real frustrations in doing this work. Before I joined the Government of Alberta, I didn't fully appreciate just how difficult it would be for me to have access to citizens. In fact, when we would try to do ethnographic research, in some of our projects, the ministries were totally fine with that and totally comfortable with it. But in many ministries, they considered ethnographic research as a form of consultation. And all consultation had to get cabinet-level approval. So that created this massive bottleneck and 4-month delays, if we could even get on the agenda, to just go out and speak to a handful of Albertans. It seemed to me like we saw our citizens as our biggest risk, not our biggest risk reduction strategy when it came to policy development. Secondly, Alberta CoLab was different than almost any other design team in government anywhere else in the world because of this unique lineage of coming from this military strategy design background. Almost every design shop that you currently look at, and there are now hundreds of them globally, they almost always start in the service ministries as a form of service design because that's where the major cost centres are in government and that's where there's a big tradition of service design that can help to improve the citizen experience. And we started at the other end, at the fuzzy front end of policy development, looking before problems had even been fully framed out. And we started there because there is great leverage, potentially, in being able to frame and reframe at that early stage. But the challenge is, we would come up with these beautiful systemic designs with our clients, and then by the time it got downstream to actually being implemented through the machinery of government, it was barely recognizable. It had been parceled out into all of these little fragments. And so that was a real concern for us, is how do we maintain design intent? And then thirdly, from that very front end of policy development, where is the line of sight to making a perceptible, positive, permanent difference in the lives of Albertans? And in too many of our projects, in our view, we couldn't draw that direct line of sight. So that was a real concern for us. And so the other thing that happened is that by this stage, we'd been through 3 premiers, 2 deputy ministers, 4 assistant deputy ministers, and so we'd lost our original champions. And so we realized that we had to pivot, both to overcome the frustrations, which we managed to do in our second iteration, but also to maintain the organizational support for the lab. And so the way that we pivoted, we shifted from doing work across the whole of government to really picking one issue that we could go into depth on, so that we became not just process experts, but also content experts. And we were embedded within the Department of Energy, and really the big strategic challenge for the government of Alberta is energy transition. How does a province like Alberta, where 50% of its GDP, directly and indirectly, comes from oil and gas, survive in a low-carbon environment? Secondly, we were worried about the sustainability of a standalone team, and so we tried to take everything we did and just embed it into systems and processes of the bureaucracy. How do you make this part of the regular strategic planning process? How do you bring foresight in at the right time to inform the executive team? How do you make sure the executive team is using a systemic design approach in running through its strategy cycle? How do you integrate that with risk management? How do you get all of the different sources and signals working as a single integrated system? And so we really focused on baking this into the bureaucracy. And the third thing we did was we partnered both with outside labs, like the Energy Futures Lab, like the Action Lab, like the City of Edmonton, so that we could actually overcome some of our own constraints, get access to citizens, engage citizens both in our communities of practice, but also in our project work. And we'd always partnered internally with our clients across government. They'd always been co-designing with us, but now we brought them even closer into actually helping to shape the whole innovation arc that we would go through of the project. That was frustrating in some ways, but ultimately it really overcame this problem of maintaining design intent. Because when our partners had designed the whole process with us and participated throughout, that transition into implementation went much more smoothly. So, first of all, if you're going to run a lab, you need to be agile, you need to be able to pivot. Calling yourself an innovation lab is almost like painting a big target on yourself. You're going to have to justify yourself 10 times more than a part of government that's been there for 30 years doing the same thing. Secondly, we found that if you've got clients and partners in the civil service who understand agile and use really good execution approaches, then they make the best clients. But that was where we've gotten our best successes. And thirdly, this idea of partnering inside and outside the lab is really the most powerful approach we've come across, where you can move to outside labs to accept risk, and you can use inside labs to navigate the machinery of government. And it really doesn't matter if they're called a lab or an innovation team. It's really change makers that we want to connect inside and outside government to do this kind of work. So 4 months ago, I moved to the Mars Solutions Lab. Yuri van den Steenhoven gave a presentation, a keynote here last year, and talked about the work that was happening to regulate the sharing economy. I don't have time to go into this here today. I'm down to 1 minute in my presentation. But it really is a great example of using a design approach to interview 136 people to do co-design workshops with over 100 stakeholders at all levels of government, and to produce a report that ended up 90% of the recommendations into regulation, the vehicle for hire regulations, which have been in place for a year now. And just last week, Lyft announced that its first expansion outside of the US is going to be Toronto. So the regulatory modernization here both regulated a highly polarized and unregulated industry, and it also reduced the regulatory burden on the existing taxi and hotel industries. Another project that the Solutions Lab has been working on since I joined, through Interweave, we ran a social innovation lab training program over 6 months virtually online, and we brought 16 new social innovation labs up through the lab methodology. And the big learning out of that was that none of those lab teams struggled with learning the innovation lab tools and techniques. They're all pretty basic. This is not rocket science. What they struggled with to a T was the authorizing environment. They're all trying to do this work off the side of the desk. They don't have the senior leadership support and coverage. They don't have people who can clear barriers out of the way. And so that is really the big challenge. If you're wanting to introduce an innovation lab, you really need to pay attention to how permissive is that authorizing environment around the lab. So I've only been at Mars for 4 months, but these are kind of my 3 lessons so far. That one comes from the Interweave course. The second lesson, I've actually always been kind of very low tech in my approach to social innovation. Just give me a room with whiteboards and post-it notes and I can do it. But being embedded in Mars, I've seen the power of bringing technology innovation and business model innovation together with social innovation. I really think this blended approach is extremely promising. And I think social innovation needs technology innovation just as much as technology innovation needs social innovation to prevent the disruption and dislocation of exclusive growth. We need inclusive growth. And thirdly, the Uber case study from the Solutions Lab shows me just what a difference that labs can provide for these complex and polarized issues. We are now starting to get these success stories of impact like that. So I'm just going to leave this slide up to finish. This is a map that we're creating of at least 31 social innovation labs across Canada. And the really remarkable thing about this is 5 years ago, there were 3 dots on this map. Now we have 31. And there's probably others that I haven't captured on here that I'm not familiar with. So I don't know if in the next 5 years how many of these labs will still be around. This is a first generation of labs. And I'm sure we'll have more labs on the landscape, but maybe some of these will go away. But really, the thing I love about this chart is it just signals Canada's courage in trying and experimenting with new approaches to deal with some of our most complex and important challenges. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Alex. I think it's your words are really powerful. I really like the concept of baking what you're doing into the bureaucracy. I think that's really powerful. Thank you very much for coming and sharing. And I know you're doing a workshop next, so I'm sure there'll be lots of policymakers in your workshop. But thank you.
Thanks very much.
Oh. Hold hands.
Yeah.
I think I'll keep him in New Brunswick. Don't go back. Sorry. And now let's move quickly to our concurrent workshops. We have Judith Holton on social movements thinking for large-scale change in the Nashwaak Sis Room. And Moses Izimon and Yuri Konga will be accelerating open data in the Marysville Room. And in this room, Alex will be leading a workshop on tabletop prototyping for policy development. Again, no matter which workshop you choose, our note takers will be creating summaries and posting them on the Govmaker website. Cyril and Nick Scott and I will introduce the workshops and allow the workshop host to run things from there. Workshop host, please note Shawnee will give you the 5-minute warning at 10:55. When the workshops are over, everyone please come back to the foyer to grab a quick drink and a snack outside this room at 11 before we restart at 11:15 with the Open Data Visualization Challenge. The rest of the day following 11:15 will take place in this room.
Alors aujourd'hui, c'est le genre de journée où on voudrait être à 3 endroits à la fois. Alors quel que soit l'atelier de votre choix, rappelez-vous qu'il y aura toujours un résumé de chacune des autres conférences qui sera mise à votre disposition. Après votre atelier, dirigez-vous donc dans le foyer pour prendre une boisson et revenir ici à partir de 11 h et emporter donc votre lunch avec vous pour le challenge des visualisations des données. À partir de 11h15, toutes les activités auront lieu dans cette salle. And don't forget to cast your vote for the People's Choice Award at ODVC before 11:15. It's time to go now.